Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi!
Hello friends. With the new Mythic announcement, there has been a relative flood of new topics and content to cover. I won't rehash everything here, but the summary is that Mythic is a new progression point beyond Legendary, and it brings along some new abilities alongside stat and ability level increases. Perhaps the most impactful change is for Machines of War. Machines of War follow a different progression system than normal characters. They effectively just have abilities and don't have gear tiers nor an attack stat. What Snowprint have done with Mythic is allow Machines of War to confer a battlefield effect that is usually tied to Mythic characters. The nice thing about this is that this has no cost per se, unlike the Machines of War primary abilities that repeatedly cost munitions to use. Today we'll discuss those battlefield effects and discuss the implications for you. Since Machines of War aren't relevant for Guild War or Tournament Arena, our focus will be on analysing these battlefield effects which focus on raid applications. What makes Mythic Machines of War more appealing is that I think it's relatively easier to access and achieve compared to getting a character to Blue Star Legendary. Incursions already give you a reliable source of shards and use a currency that doesn't overlap with other game modes and priorities. That is to say, you can spend your incursion tickets without stressing that you're missing out on farming gear upgrades. Incursions are also made slightly easier with the new incursion buffs, where you can add things like additional summons, hits, and resurrections depending on the path you choose. I've only done a little bit of testing, but I was able to complete the Mythic incursion tracks using Diamond 2 and Diamond 3 characters, being mindful that you should try and bring summoners when possible. The rewards add another layer of nuance and value to incursions. Mythic stuff, simply put, is currently quite hard to get. Badges, orbs, shards, and crucially upgrades are all hidden behind different game modes. Incursions, while giving you Machines of War shards, also have a ton of mythic gear tucked away inside, and this should factor in at least a little when it comes to decision making. On screen here is a summary of the repeatable rewards. Should you choose to spend all of your incursion tickets on the Mythic stage, you'll end up with 7 Mythic badges and 14 Legendary badges among other rewards. If you're here for the 15-second summary, I've outlined every Machine of War currently in the game and their Mythic effects. I'll leave this on screen to digest before diving into the specifics. We'll look at the machines in order of release schedule, and therefore first up is the Malleus Machine of War. This machine gives bonus damage to ranged attacks provided the enemy is adjacent to a friendly Mythic character or Cadian Guardsman. The ability starts with 10% bonus damage and scales to 20% bonus damage at max Mythic rarity. It's interesting because the raw damage bonus is pretty strong, comparable to effects offered by abilities like Atlakoya's passive or Roswitha's active. However, it only applies to ranged attacks, and there are a dearth of good ranged damage dealers at the moment. When I first saw this ability, I wondered about its use for the Psyker team. The Nearthrope obviously benefits from the extra range damage, and you already have a Mythic character you can put into melee in the form of Roswitha or Atlakoya. The Cadian Guard condition in this passive is not reliably achievable in my opinion, since these units will typically want to move and attack at range when possible. It's a strong effect, but one I'm not super excited about until we have a proper ranged meta. As if the Biovore needed more reason to be considered the best Machine of War in the game, it now has a pretty strong Mythic ability. The ability is straightforward. Enemies that are damaged by a friendly Spore Mine take bonus damage from Mythic units for 1 round. The ability starts at 10% bonus damage and scales to 20%. Given that you can often anticipate boss positioning and movement, it's trivial to get this effect to apply most turns, and that means you can potentially get a flat 20% bonus to your raid scores. Simple, yet satisfying. The Forgefiend Machine of War is the first machine we look at with a more defensive outlook. It gives your Mythic characters between 10 and 20% damage reduction if they are on a hex with a hex effect. That obviously works with your own Forgefiend, where you can apply the Fire Hex effect to a bunch of hexes and then protect your Mythic units on those hexes. We can remind ourselves that the only 3 hex effects currently in the game are Fire Hex, Ice Hex, and the Contaminated Hex effect. Only 1 hex effect can be active at once, and the most recent effect overrides the old ones. The easiest potential application I can see for this is against the Avatar of Cain, who already sets a lot of hexes on fire. You basically take 20% less damage from his abilities, which is great, and you can use the Forgefiend to kill the Guardians that spawn. Another easy win is against Tan Gi'Da, the side boss fight for Belisarius' Call. There are lots of contamination hex effects that are created by virtue of the fight mechanics, and you need to take the Forgefiend anyway to deal with Tan Gi'Da's summons. The more interesting application, and now we're into the realms of theory crafting, is using this machine to help your characters survive where they otherwise wouldn't have. The Mortarion boss fight is an example. Historically, you haven't been able to use the AdMech, for example, until your characters were at a certain gear threshold. There is potentially a world where the Forgefiend lets your characters survive those crucial turns against Mortarion's anti-melee damage aura. Galatian is similar to the Forgefiend in that it is another damage reduction machine of war. Again, the range is between 10 and 20% reduction, but the conditions are slightly different. This time, your friendly mythic characters take reduced damage if they are adjacent to another mythic character or the Dreadnought himself. I think this is potentially an even easier battlefield defensive buff to achieve when it comes to the Forgefiend, especially when we look long term and most of our characters will eventually end up at mythic rarity. The easiest applications here are for the mech team, and again, the bosses we discussed earlier, like Mortarion and the Avatar, stand out as easy wins. Note that summons will not get this bonus. I also wondered about Magnus for the Dreadnought. The Eye of Magnus effect can be pretty lethal, and it targets a character that is your main damage dealer, usually adjacent to another character to get buffs. So what if you had a mythic Helbrecht, for example? It might allow your Ragnar or whoever to survive a bit longer. This is speculation though, and I think the Biovore will still probably win out because enemy unit positioning is so crucial to success for this fight. 3 in a row, the Broadside has another battlefield reduction effect with the same 10 to 20% range. The conditions are possibly the easiest to achieve. Units that have been hit by Marker Light or ranged attacks deal less damage to your mythic units. This ability works on bosses, but not on unmodifiable abilities, like the Gaze of Magnus for example. The Plagueburst Crawler returns us to damage buffing battlefield effects. Your units deal bonus damage to units on the Contamination Hex effect. You can apply this effect freely every single turn through the Plagueburst Crawler's secondary ability, making this possibly the most attractive machine of war for overall damage increase. The only caveat is that you'll be flooding the map with hex effects that potentially make your units more vulnerable, especially if you're running a non-mech team. For example, I'm very tempted to run the Plagueburst Crawler with my Custodes team, but I am conscious that for fights like Magnus it could spell an early end for me, especially since that boss flies around so much and the summons hit reasonably hard. If you use the Crawler with the mechs, in a lot of ways it just looks like a straight up 20% damage increase. The last machine of war is the Exorcist Battle Tank. It's a cool one and slightly different to the others. This battlefield effect gives your mythic units a shield when they crit or attack an enemy that is on a hex with fire. Relying on crits makes it slightly less reliable compared to the other machines, and that RNG aspect makes me less excited by it. But with teams like the Psyker team, hitting a unit on fire is trivial, so it can give them a lot of extra survivability. On screen here, you can see me using the machine against the Avatar of Cain, and the Psyker characters barely lose any health due to their additional shield. You're already bringing this machine of war for the Psyker team due to the damage boost on Neurothrope, and therefore this extra shield effect just seems like gravy. In terms of personal priorities for incursion tracks to focus on and build, this is my list. My belief is that the original uses for these machines, whether that is positioning manipulation, mech team synergy, or killing summons, generally outweighs the battlefield passives. I'm taking the machines that I use the most up to Mythic, and then treating their Mythic battlefield abilities as a nice, powerful bonus effect. Okay, that's all I've got for this one. Another early look at another feature for Mythic, but an important one, because I think that machines of war will be easier to take to Mythic than regular characters most of the time. Thanks as always to my Patreons for their support, and bye for now.